Now. So good evening. I am Amy Frake. I'm the Youth Programs Coordinator here at Holocaust Museum Houston. I want to welcome you to the fourth event of the Dismantling Bias, Anti-Semitism, White Supremacy, and Inequality lecture series presented by HEB. We extend a heartfelt thank you to HEB for their generous support in helping the museum host this important series of conversations. Before we begin, please note that the chat has been disabled, and we ask that you place your questions in the Q&A link at any time during the presentation. Tonight's lecture, Coming Out as Dalit, is presented by Yashica Dutt. Yashica Dutt is a journalist and the author of Coming Out as Dalit. She spent a decade covering arts, culture, and fashion in New Delhi, and a lifetime hiding her Dalitness to pass as upper caste, until she came out as Dalit in a Facebook note and wrote a book that's part nonfiction, part memoir, and wholly a scathing account of how the caste system operates and affects Dalits in today's India. Hint, brutally. Her work explores the intersection of caste, class, and gender, and seeks to expose caste as the invisible arm that turns the gears in nearly every system in India. Coming Out as Dalit has received immense critical acclaim from the press and readers. It has been called an eye-opening contribution to Dalit literature and a book that will likely play a major role in influencing the millennial expression of being a Dalit. Dutt graduated from Columbia Journalism School and lives in New York. Her work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Foreign Policy, and she is planning to soon release Coming Out as Dalit worldwide. So please welcome Yashica Dutt. Hang on, you're muted.
And without further delay, let's get into it. Thanks everybody for joining us. We are today going to talk about caste, about how caste affects people not just in India, but in the United States. And we're going to learn in detail about what that narrative looks like. So first of all, thank you so much to the Holocaust Museum in Houston for inviting me, and a generous and heartfelt thanks to the museum CEO, Kelly Zuniga, for making the series possible, and to Wendy Warren and Amy Frake for coordinating with me to bring this lecture online in the midst of an ongoing pandemic. Before we get into this lecture, I'd like to announce a trigger warning for the content that follows. It contains descriptions of rape, trauma, and suicide. And for those of you watching who feel they are currently not in the correct frame of mind to receive this information, you might want to revisit later. I'm sure many of you are wondering why a series that for the past several weeks has focused on dismantling bias and inequalities in the United States is featuring an author who has recently come out as Dalit, who even is a Dalit person. And why does someone feel the need to come out as one? Well, then you're in the right window screen, because for the next few minutes, I'm about to tell you about a kind of discrimination that is so persistent that over 200 million people around the world are affected by it. An inequality that is so severe that up until a few decades ago, most of those who were affected by it had no right to touch books, own land, or do any type of job other than the humiliating, dehumanizing work that is decreed to them over centuries. An oppression that is so subtle and diabolical in its effect that it has existed right under our noses for many years, without most of us even recognizing it. That, my dear friends and listeners, is the discrimination based on caste. It is a system of inequality that originated in India thousands of years ago and till date continues to brutally and systemically affect millions of those around the world who belong to lower, oppressed, and untouchable castes. And Dalit is a self-chosen term used by many such individuals who, instead of the societal shame and humiliation imposed on them, want to reclaim their identities and declare an assertion of pride and self-worth. And I happen to be one of them. I was born in a Dalit manual scavenger caste in Ajmer. Manual scavengers are families who are assigned to clean toilets and bathrooms, often the dry kind, without any protective gloves or equipment. It is assigned to us at birth, and from which, until India's constitution allowed us in 1950, we had no way to escape. Ajmer, where I was born, is a small town in Rajasthan, which also happens to be one of the largest and driest states in India. Think Texas, but with caste discrimination that is so unrelenting that in the 1950s, when my grandfather hopped on a horse to lead his wedding procession to the house of his soon-to-be wife, as is traditional Hindu custom, men from the oppressor castes charged at his wedding party with naked, bloodthirsty swords. Because it was insulting to their caste pride that a lower, untouchable man participated in a ritual that was only reserved for those who were born superior. They were allowed to pass only when my grandfather got off the horse and walked on foot to my grandmother's house. A few decades ago, when his father and my great-grandfather tried to get an education, he was forbidden from touching books or even entering the classroom. Why? Because Dalits at the time were considered so untouchable that even their touch could pollute the books and notebooks, slates and pens that his fellow upper caste students used at the time. So he had to learn how to draw the alphabet by scrawling a stick in the mud outside the classroom from where he could barely hear what the teacher was saying. One would imagine that close to 3 generations later, in the early 2000s, in an India that was then careening towards neoliberalization, poised to become one of the fastest growing economies and a potential global superpower in the coming century, that discrimination would be forgotten, or at least lose some of its sting. We can go to the next slide, Amy. Thank you. Well, that's what I thought. When at 15, I decided to ignore my mother's advice to lie about my caste whenever someone asked what it was. And they always did, repeatedly. And for the first time, I decided to tell the truth. What's the worst that could happen? I thought as I sat at the coffee table in a friend's house, when on my way back from school, her parents had invited me over for tea and casually inquired about my caste. Despite being born in what was possibly one of the lowest, most loathed castes in India, I was still a hot-headed teenager who was tired of lying about who I was and who naively believed that the educated doctor parents of my friend wouldn't care about my caste. But the moment those words left my mouth, my head hung, my gaze lowered, terrified of looking at their faces. I knew I shouldn't have told them the truth. I'm an SC. I replied, referring to the scheduled caste, the government term for lower or formerly untouchable castes. They all turned silent. It was like I had dropped a bomb. I left feeling terrible about what I'd done and wondering how just by acknowledging the most basic truth about my identity, I had possibly jeopardized not just my friendship, but also possibly my grades at the hand of the largely Hindu upper caste teachers in the Catholic convent where I studied. Next day in the school bus, when I went to say hi to my friend, as I often did, she looked right through me, like I didn't exist. As if by revealing my lower caste origins, I had gone from being a model, grade-scoring student with whom her parents wanted her to be friends with, to someone who ranked so low on the scale of caste superiority that they didn't even need to be acknowledged. That day I learned that my mother was right, and that I had to stay in the closet of my caste, one where I would lie every time someone asked about it, devise ways so I could look, behave, and appear more upper caste, and live in the terror of the consequences if someone were to find out that I was Dalit. Despite all that, it might surprise you to learn that I was still among the privileged few who lived in an urban area and whose family, although very recently, but successfully had extricated ourselves from our generation ordained caste profession of manual scavenging. Most of India's Dalit population lives in heavily segregated rural areas, where the closet of caste doesn't exist, since they have no way to lie or escape from it. In those areas, even today, Dalit grooms are met with not just humiliation. Can we move forward? Not just humiliation, but direct violence for leading the wedding procession on a horse, just like my grandfather 70 years ago. In February, people from upper castes threw stones at a wedding party where a Dalit groom was riding a horse in the Indian state of Gujarat. The groom was then forced down from the horse and beaten for showing signs of caste superiority that were known to be reserved only for upper castes, even in 2020. But riding a horse is far from the only seemingly innocuous activity for which Dalits are forced to face violence. In 2019, a 20-year-old Dalit man from the same state of Gujarat was violently beaten by a gang of upper caste men. His crime? The men from oppressor castes had taken offense to the young Dalit man for growing a mustache, which, based on certain caste norms, is also only permissible for men from the upper castes. While their actions might appear seemingly harmless, particularly to those of us outside the caste system, for Dalits who dare to defy these invisible yet extremely rigid societal codes, the price can be dangerous. When another young Dalit man refused to shave his mustache a few years ago in 2017, members of the upper caste who were Rajputs killed him with a switchblade for his defiance. These cases of outright murders that dominant castes in India commit to protect so-called honor and caste pride of their upper caste families are not the vagaries of a primitive society still adjusting to the rhythms of a developing world. In fact, they are a very contemporary response to the idea of Dalits asserting themselves as equals in a society that insists on treating them and us as subhuman. These crimes, the likes of which take place once every 15 minutes against a Dalit person in India, are a backlash to our visibility, our presence, and our defiance against a social order, which places us at the bottom of the scale of humanity. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, even on that descending scale of contempt, words which Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the architect of the Indian Constitution and India's foremost leader of anti-caste ideology, used to describe the caste system, it is Dalit women who suffer the most. Next slide. Some of you might have heard about the rape of an Indian woman that made headlines around the world in early October this year. Prominent activists, academics, and scholars, including the likes of Angela Davis and Gloria Steinem, had raised alarm in solidarity with the young woman at the center of this horrifying crime. All of 17, she was working in a field in a small town of Hathras in the Indian state of Uttar Pradesh when a group of Thakur upper caste men decided to drag her to an isolated place and rape her. But their bone-chilling act wasn't just limited to sexual assault. Instead, they had also crushed her spine and cut off her tongue because she had seemingly resisted their assault, while also crushing any chances of her survival. In the next 15 days, as the young girl fought for her life and eventually succumbed, her body ferried from one hospital to the next, her violent rape and assault became a flashpoint and a burning example of how Dalits and Dalit women in particular are devalued in Indian societies. Starting with the police that initially refused to file a first information report and then played a key role in protecting the accused by forcefully cremating the young Dalit woman's body in the dead of the night without the consent of her family. It seemed as if the entire system of upper caste authorities had come together to defend the upper caste rapists instead of punishing them for their heinous and brutal crime. One of the lead police officers in the case went as far as to claim that the Dalit woman was not even raped, even when the medical reports clearly proved otherwise. While the upper caste Thakur men and women in her village, the caste to which the rapists also belonged to, took out rallies and processions in support of the accused, claiming that it was them and not the dead Dalit girl whose mother had begged the police to allow her to see her daughter for one last time while she was cruelly disposed, who were the real victims in the scenario. Next slide, please. This level of heartbreaking cruelty and astonishing apathy is neither new nor unfamiliar for Dalit women. Next slide. Almost 10 Dalit women were raped every day on an average in India in 2019. And that's not counting the cases that go unreported or where the survivors are intimidated into withdrawing their complaint. Pushed down to the absolute bottom of the social order that is already severely lopsided, Dalit women suffer for their gender and their untouchable castes. And while rural areas often see the worst, most stark examples of this intersection of violence, Indian cities are not that much safer for Dalit women either. Next slide. In 2019, Dr. Payal Tadvi, a second-year medical student in one of Mumbai's top medical colleges, was forced to commit suicide after she was harassed and humiliated for 6 months by 3 upper caste senior students, all of whom were women. Tadvi was from a lower caste tribal family and had availed the affirmative action policy that constitutionally offers Dalit and tribal students an access into the otherwise upper caste bastions of education. The aspiring gynecologist shared a room with 2 of the 3 perpetrators who would subject her to daily indignities, like wiping their dirty feet on the mattress that she had, which was on the floor, and insulting her in front of other doctors and even patients while using caste slurs and abuses. They also managed to prevent her from conducting surgeries and planted roadblocks in the way of Tadvi finishing her degree. Next slide. After months of complaining and confiding in other students and her family about the caste-based abuse, Dr. Payal Tadvi hung herself in her room, ultimately leading to her death. And unfortunately, she is far from the only Dalit student who has been coerced into suicide on the account of caste-based discrimination and harassment in the recent years. Next slide. The bullying and harassment of Dalit students in Indian colleges and universities is somewhat of an epidemic that has driven many of them to either quit or take their own lives. According to a 2016 study, out of the 25 students who committed suicide between 2007 and 2013, 23 were Dalit. Dalit students, who often also happen to be the first among their families to attend college, face a severe lack of support and bias in availing the affirmative action, which was a remedial policy instituted in the Constitution by its architect and Dalit rights leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. But thanks to the hateful anti-Dalit bias prevalent in these institutions, it is now used to target the very students it was created to protect. Dalit students who avail the reservation, as it is commonly called, are singled out for shockingly cruel ragging practices by upper caste students and given obstinately low grades by mostly upper caste teachers who somehow believe that Dalits have no place in higher education and inherently lack merit. But not too long ago, something changed. In 2016, there was a letter that changed how Dalits would assert themselves in a way that had never been done before. We can keep going through the slides. So, after graduating from Columbia a few months ago, I heard about the suicide of a Dalit student that was making rounds on Indian social media. Not many newspapers and media outlets had picked on that story yet. But clearly, this news had galvanized many individuals, many of whom seemed to be mourning his death, despite having never met him in person. That was Rohit Demolar, a Dalit activist who was forced to commit suicide after the administration of the University of Hyderabad, where he was a PhD student at the time, had systematically discriminated against him for months for calling out their casteist policies. Sitting in a cafe in Chelsea one cold evening in late January of 2016, I read his heartbreaking suicide note, where he talked about his mind made of stardust and how his birth in a lower Dalit caste was a fatal accident. Having spent almost a decade in journalism in Delhi before moving to New York, I was still hiding my caste, except here in the multi-ethnic, multi-racial framework of United States. My untouchable caste didn't carry the same charges back home. Reading that letter, I realized that I had never read anything written by a Dalit person before. In an effort to escape my identity, I avoided anything that could remotely give away my secret. The journalist in me decided to investigate further. Who was this person? And where did he have this courage to not only speak his truth, but to stand up for others who could not do that themselves? In the next few minutes on his Facebook profile, I noticed a photo of him in a red shirt, the exact same one I had seen in my inbox a week ago when I noticed his friend request before deleting it. While I was not ready to be open with my Dalitness, I had joined a few groups of like-minded people on Facebook, where presumably he had found my profile and wanted to reach out. And reach out he did, even from the great beyond. Reading through his Facebook posts, I learned that much like my own mother, his mother had belabored through odd and low-paying jobs without much support from her husband to put her 3 children through school and college. That, like me, he grew up with very little money and sent whatever he received through a fellowship back home to support his family. And I realized that with a few simple twists of fate and circumstance, that life he led could have easily been mine, where I was the one thwarted by the system and crushed by the casteist paradigms of the society who could have ended up dead. Except I wasn't. I was in New York and way more privileged than someone who, despite no options, did not choose to remain quiet. So I decided to write a Facebook note announcing the launch of a Tumblr I called Documents of Dalit Discrimination. where Dalits could have the safe space to discuss our traumas, our oppression, our collective histories that weren't of shame, but pride. I also realized that before I asked anyone else to share their story, I needed to do that myself first. So for the first time ever, I wrote about my untouchable manual scavenging caste, the trauma that came from building an entirely different identity, and the shame it ingrained in my own. And I decided to come out as Dalit. It's possible that some of you are still wondering how an oppressed identity that manifests its worst, most trenchant consequences in a country that's well thousands of miles away has anything to do with the inequality and biases in the United States. Well, I'm about to bust that myth wide open for you. This threat of caste-based oppression doesn't just exist in India or even in other countries in South Asia, but is proliferating and affecting thousands of people, superbly hiding in plain sight, right here in the United States. This summer, California's Department of Fair Employment and Housing regulators sued the multinational tech giant Cisco for discrimination. But unlike the relatively known discriminations of race, gender, sexuality, and disability, this lawsuit was based on the discrimination of caste. A Dalit engineer had alleged that his Brahmin upper caste managers had harassed him and stopped his warranted promotions over the course of a few years, ever since they found out that he was from a lower Dalit caste. One of the upper caste perpetrators was in the Indian Institute of Technology at the same time as the Dalit engineer and had discovered that he had availed the affirmative action policy, concluding that he might be Dalit. After months of humiliation, lost work opportunities, and blocked pay raises, the Dalit engineer decided to take this matter to court. And his single act of defiant courage opened a whole can of casteist worms that had been breeding for decades in the South Asian dominant spaces in Silicon Valley. In a story I reported for the New York Times, dozens of Dalit employees went on record to discuss how they had faced almost identical circumstances at the hands of their Indian upper caste seniors in the United States. Many of them could never openly discuss their caste, and among everyone I spoke, not a single person wanted to reveal their identity for the fear of backlash from their upper caste co-workers, which according to one participant, could ruin their careers. Moreover, in the absence of a law to protect their rights, the lack of basic understanding of caste as a living present reality in this country, and given their vulnerability with their work-related visas, on which their entire survival in the US depends on, most of them have no choice but to suffer in silence. A few weeks after the Cisco case, another tech giant, HCL, was also sued by a Dalit employee for similar wrongful termination by an upper caste superior for his lower caste. Additionally, Equality Labs, an Indian American Dalit civil rights organization, received complaints from 260 Dalit employees who worked at companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft about incidents of caste-based slurs and jokes, bullying, discriminatory hiring practices, bias in peer reviews, and sexual harassment. Soon after, a coalition of 30 Dalit female engineers reached out to the Washington Post in a statement on the harassment they were facing at tech companies throughout the country. But it's not just the Silicon Valley where caste-based discrimination is beginning to show its hateful biases. According to a 2018 survey by Equality Labs, more than 67% of Dalits in the Indian diaspora have admitted to facing caste-based discrimination in their workplace. And even outside of work, 40% Dalits admitted that they felt unwelcome in places of worship, tracing directly to casteist attitudes in India, where Dalits continue to be killed for entering Hindu places of worship and temples. Indian Americans are among the fastest growing immigrant populations in the United States. A multitude of CEOs, heads of corporations, entertainers, and political figures come from this rapidly influential demographic base. And especially with the history-making win of Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who was born to an Indian mother and a Jamaican father, India and South Asia's general prominence in the cultural landscape is only about to grow stronger. Then isn't this the right time to stop and wonder that why do upper caste folks who make for less than 40% of India's population are overrepresented with over 90% population of Indian Americans in the United States? Why, when so many CEOs and department heads are Indian, not one of them is Dalit? Current Google CEO Sundar Pichai and Amazon board member and former PepsiCo CEO Indra Nooyi are both Brahmins, the highest and the uppermost caste in the caste system. It's the same caste whose culture, rituals, and traditions shaped a majority of the childhood of Kamala Harris, whose mother was also Brahmin and had raised her daughters in accordance with the same culture after divorcing their father. We need to ask, why do so many upper caste Indians who are more than happy to rightfully claim their representation in the diversity practices of the United States are able to act with such impunity when it comes to discriminating Dalits against their caste? And most importantly, why are these multinational tech companies, some of which have had outposts in India for decades, allowed to get away with the blatant caste discrimination in their midst? A Washington Post story revealed that Microsoft had to intervene and shut down an internal communication thread that was derogatory to Dalits all the way back in 2006. And we need to understand how caste lives, breathes, and operates all around us. Many of us as non-South Asians have more than a passing familiarity with the culture of this vibrant subcontinent. Whether it's through the colorful depictions of Indian life through its cinema, the increasingly positive representation of South Asians in shows like Never Have I Ever and Patriot Act, and the ubiquitous presence of the big fat Indian wedding that is a permanent fixture of the American social landscape. We observe and absorb South Asia, and especially India, through an inherently upper caste lens. As we pay more attention to the rightful demands for greater diversity, it's also crucial to look out for the underrepresented minority within the minority, that is the Indian American community. There are telling signs, questions, and actions that most upper caste Indians use as codes to inquire an Indian person's caste. The question that's always a deciding factor in where to place the respondent on a descending scale of contempt. They send out seemingly subtle inquiries of whether someone is vegetarian, and if so, then is it for religious reasons? They make demands to reveal the rank someone inquired in the countrywide engineering or medical exam in India to ascertain whether they availed reservation, the affirmative action policy, and therefore, if they're Dalit. They even ask direct questions about which specific neighborhood in which region they belong to in India and want to know who they are married to. These are just some of the common caste locators among Indians in the United States. If you're familiar with the hit Netflix show Indian Matchmaking, you'll probably know that marriages take place within Indian families families are often arranged, both in India and the United States. But what most of us miss is that arranging marriages that most often is done on the basis of caste is the most foolproof way to sustain this odious system, which might also explain why so many Indian parents continue to have an outsized opinion on who their children marry. More specifically, caste in academia in the United States is worth paying close attention to, where a bulk of international students are from India, along with several of their professors, many of whom carry the same biases that Dalits don't have the merit to belong in institutes of higher learning, leaving them vulnerable to the same discrimination, even in a country where they assume themselves safe from the same humiliation they faced back home. One of the reasons I was able to come out as Dalit after living with a false identity for close to 30 years, along with Rohit Demolar's searing last letter, was that I was living in the United States. It was here that probably for the first time ever, I felt free from the constant tyranny of the question that was my caste, where I felt safe from the perpetual fear of being outed or found out that I was an untouchable Dalit. It was here that I finally learned how to remove the shame from my history and replace it with pride in my identity. As folks who care and are committed to social justice and making our societies free from biases and inequalities, it is our responsibility to keep this country safe from this loathsome bias of caste, so more people like me can feel truly free to find and be themselves. And for that, we need to understand and help eradicate the hateful spine of caste, wherever we may encounter it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was really, really great and really interesting. And I'm glad that we were able to make all of this work. So I do have some questions for you in the Q&A. And as a reminder, everyone, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A and I can pass them along. So the first question is asking, why does the Indian government turn a blind eye to the continuation of the caste system?
This is slightly a complex answer, and I'm going to try to answer this as best I can in the limited time. The Indian government doesn't, on paper, support the caste system. There are laws against untouchability. Practicing caste is officially looked down upon, and there are laws that prevent the crimes against SC/ST people, who are the Dalits and tribal people in India, from happening. But what does end up happening is that in almost all forms of government, people who make these decisions are upper caste. So they are driven to protect their interests and are not looking beyond their own privileges. More than that, India has maintained a narrative that caste is an internal matter. Most recently, in the 90s, in 2001, in Durban, there was a conference that wanted to make caste as one of the indices, which are the same as racism. And among the countries that were opposing it, India was on top, because they kept insisting that caste is an internal matter and we're going to solve it on our own, not wanting to look bad on the world stage. This is a response that I get from many Indians myself when they say, well, let's not talk about this in the United States. Let's keep this all guarded, because they want to project this image that casteism doesn't exist, or caste biases in India don't exist, or when casteism is practiced, it is only done in a small section of the society, or it happened way back in ancient India. None of that is true. Casteism is, like I mentioned, a living, breathing, present reality, not just in India, but also in the United States. And it only goes to serve the interests of the government to maintain the shining example of India, along with the 90% of upper caste population that is not interested in talking about negatives of a country where they come from, when they are often driven to protect this minority status, which they rightfully have in this country. So that is like a complex but short answer to why the Indian government does not give us protections. Protections exist on paper. There are many laws. It's just about how they're implemented and the lack of the will to implement them.
Thank you. Yeah, that reminds me of something that you mentioned several times in your book that I thought was really interesting and that reminded me a lot about how racism operates in the United States as well. This idea that for upper caste people, caste is kind of invisible. It's this idea of, well, I haven't experienced this. Why does caste matter when it isn't having that negative impact on all these different aspects of their life? So I thought that was a really interesting point that kind of reminded me of that. So kind of on the same note, someone is asking what percentage of the Indian population is Dalit?
So currently, there are over 200 million people that are Dalit in India, and the population of the country is 1 billion plus. So close to between 25 and 30%, the current census, which will happen next year, might be able to give us more accurate results. But also, it's hard to really predict, because what the Indian government does is that there is no census that takes place on the basis of caste. It's like if in the US there was no census that took place on the basis of race, there would be no way to find out. So these figures are found out through many different ways, but there is no direct census. However, we can safely say that a little above 25% of India's total population is Dalit.
Thank you. So someone was asking about what the name of your book was. So can you tell us just a little bit about your book, what it's called, maybe where we could potentially find it if we're interested?
Absolutely. So as I talked a little bit about the note that I wrote on Facebook and launched the Tumblr, and I soon got this offer to write a book, and I decided to make it about my coming out story. And the reason I wanted to call it that was because, like I've described, it felt like it was a closet of caste. And I wanted to create a term that could accurately summarize the experience that so many Dalits go through. So that's why the note was about coming out as a Dalit person. And the book is also called Coming Out as Dalit. And it's currently published in India. It is available on Amazon in the US and other countries. However, like I mentioned, you mentioned in the bio that I am still looking to bring it to the United States. But for those of you who are interested, you can definitely find it on Amazon. Coming Out as Dalit. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And I do really recommend it. It's really fascinating, expounds a lot more on a lot of the things talked about in the lecture. I learned a lot about it, and we found it on Amazon. So check it out if you're interested. We have another question kind of related to your book about what was the writing process like for you as you were writing and working on your book?
Wow, great question. So I want to start by saying I never wanted to write a book. I thought of myself as a really pure journalist, one who did not have any grand notions of writing a book. So when this book offer came my way, I just needed to throw myself into it. The process was really intense and grueling, and it spanned over 3 years. I wrote several drafts, and my goal was to not write an academic book, but to write a book that somebody who was 15 years old back in India, who was actually facing this kind of bullying and casteism from their classmates, they could pick it up and they could read it, and they could stand up to the bullying of their upper caste classmates as well as teachers, and they could understand that they didn't have to be ashamed of who they were, that their history came from a deep sense of pride, that our people have fought against so much and we still continue to survive. So one of my goals was to make the book as accessible and as cleanly and simply written as possible. But I also wanted to include a lot of data and a lot of research, because one of the accusations that a lot of Dalit authors get is that we write from a place of emotion. We are too emotional. All we talk about is our trauma, and that could be subjective. So as a journalist, I wanted to present everybody with the facts and the research, so you could see that what I was saying was rooted in reality, and it was not something that Dalits had made up in our mind or something that we felt. So the writing process was long, and I'm grateful to have written it, but that is one of the reasons I'm not writing another book just yet.
Well, I hope you will eventually, because I did really enjoy your first one. And I do think you did. It really came through with using facts and statistics. And I think that's really interesting because, once again, this is something that is an accusation that's used against people of color in the United States, is you're being too emotional, you're being too sensitive. So it's really interesting. And this really came out for me reading the book, how many similarities there were to what you were talking about, to many elements of the conversation we're having about race in the United States today. So someone has a question asking, as language is responsible for solidifying narrative, how strong has the push been to do away with terms like upper caste and lower caste, dominant versus oppressed castes?
That's a great question. And this was something I struggled with myself right from the moment I wrote that Facebook note, because I didn't want that distinction to affect my internal idea of who I was. When we write upper caste, when we say upper, we are inherently accepting that that person who belongs to a Brahmin caste is inherently superior than me. And when I call myself lower, when I call myself untouchable, I accept, as the world accepts, that I am indeed lower. So my attempt was to find that space between making people understand that these terms are irrelevant, but at the same time, letting them know that these are the terms that cause the violence and the trauma that we suffer. So throughout the book, how I've used that is that I've used upper and lower in quotes, just so people understand that these are not terms that are supposed to be taken at face value, that we are supposed to think about their usage. However, there are many more options available. My friend and really brilliant academic, Dr. Suraj Yengre, who's at Harvard, he uses the term oppressor castes a lot of for upper caste people. A lot of people say dominant castes because they are dominant, and it's a form of behavior rather than a basic stated fact. So there are ways to subvert this language, but for me it was important that when I said upper caste, people understood what I was talking about, but I still put it under quotes so they would know that there was a defiance on my end to not accept that term just plainly.
Thank you. And once again, that's a kind of debates about language, especially this year in the United States. There's been a lot of that going on as well. So someone else
Absolutely.
asked, so first of all, they said, thank you for your powerful lecture and for featuring the beautiful artwork of Dalit artists and activists. So they asked, do you have recommendations of Dalit journalists, artists, writers, activists that people can follow to learn more about these issues?
Absolutely. Especially like I mentioned with Rohit Demolar's last letter, it did bring sort of a cultural um, re revisiting of the Dalit narrative, is what I would say, not to erase all the incredible work that activists have been doing for years before that, for decades. But with his death, it brought this trauma into the mainstream. And since then, like, of course, I talked about my note where, I used the words, came out as Dalit for the first time. People were confused. They wanted to know what coming out meant. Why was I appropriating or using an LGBT term? So I did a lot of explaining when it came to that. So I there are lots of artists. One of them is Priyanka Paul, who I featured in the presentation. Look her up. Her handle on Instagram and Twitter is Art Whoring. And then there is Bakery Prasad, who is Siddhesh Gautam, who's also somebody I've featured in the presentation. It's Bakery Prasad, Prased. If there is a way for us to make the presentation public, I would be happy to do that, and everybody can look those artists up there. Beyond that, there is a lot of Dalit music that is coming out of the country, which is kind of resistance music, which is talking about the same themes of pride and assertion, and finding that our identity is something we can reclaim. Along with that, there are lots of movies by Dalit directors that Neeraj Ghaiwan is one director. These are, of course, names that if those of you are interested, you can follow me on Twitter. I'll be putting out a list maybe in the next hour or so about people you can follow. These are some incredible folks who talk about Dalit history, Dalit lives. There is Dr. Suraj Yengre, who you might want to look up. There is Dhruvo Jyoti, who is a queer Dalit journalist who is in India, which, I have so much respect for them because they're navigating the space of being queer and being Dalit, which are these oppressed identities. And in India, to be queer has very different meanings. So there are a lot of incredible people who are doing amazing work, especially back home, which I feel is an incredibly courageous choice, which something that I couldn't make myself. So if you follow me on Twitter at Yashica Dutt, I'm happy to put out a list of people you can follow.
Thank you. I think a lot of us would really appreciate that. So someone asked, are there upper caste people who are working to help eliminate the stigma of caste?
Of course there are. There is always need for allies. There have been activists, there are people who provide platforms, there are people who are willing to pass the mic. One of the most famous depictions of caste, Malkraj Anand wrote in the 40s. He's an upper caste man, right? But that is not the work I want to talk about, to be frankly honest. I think my platform is for Dalit voices. They have been suppressed for far too long. And while I do want to uplift and echo our upper caste brothers and sisters who are in this, form of resistance, I think I want to focus more on Dalit folks, because our voices have been marginalized for way too long. However, if you are an upper caste person, you're an upper caste Indian, and you want to look into ways to eradicate caste structures around you, there are several ways to be, using Abraham X. Kandi's term anti-racist, how you can be anti-casteist. So of course, one of them is to talk to your friends and family, to observe these caste structures that are so ingrained in our societies, to first make the invisible visible. Caste is so present, it's like air. Most Indians don't notice it. So maybe the work starts with acknowledging and recognizing that no matter what you see around you, if you are an Indian person or even from the South Asian subcontinent, because caste exists in Pakistan and Nepal and Sri Lanka as well. So look around you and understand how this structure supports and propagates caste. That's where the work starts first.
Thank you, and I hope there can be more people doing some of that work. But I'm glad that you're trying to really center these voices. So speaking of voices, someone said, "Thank you for sharing your poignant journey with us. So your voice and activism are truly inspiring." And they asked, "Do you have advice for young students in the classroom who are trying to find their voice and their role in the world today?"
So I think this is a question that merits intersectionality. A young student in India who is in a rural part of the country and who is a Dalit person will not have the same experience as a young student in the United States who's presumably white. So I guess my first advice would be, if you're a young person, try and understand your role in the social order. And based on that, whether you're from a marginalized identity or you're from a dominant identity, understand the work that you need to undertake. But as far as finding your voice is concerned, for me, what really helped was, of course, reading people and reading and following people who were doing this kind of work, where they were talking about and discovering ways about how you can find voice, craft narratives, and center issues. I myself have learned this from doing. unfortunately or fortunately, I didn't go to school to do this. I've not been to a social justice school, so this is just something I've picked up along the way. But my advice would be to look around people we can follow, read work from people who are doing work in this area, and understand your place in the world. That's where the work starts first.
Thank you. That's helpful, and I hope that that's something that students can, and all of us honestly, can keep working on. So one of the questions that we like to end with is asking, what are you working on now? What are you kind of working on and doing right now?
Right. So, like I mentioned, I'm not working on another book, but what I am working on is bringing coming out as Dalit to the United States. And I'm hoping with Isabel Wilkerson's incredible book, which focuses on caste, but uses caste as a framework to understand race, we can now create space that also gives a voice to the caste system from India. And in that sense, it's my effort and energy right now, apart from my day job, which is in advertising, it's focused on creating a space for the book over here and really talking about caste, like this lecture. And I have another couple of lectures coming up in the next few months in December, January, and February. So if, like I said, if you follow me on social media, you can get information from there. Right now, my focus is to create a space for us to talk about caste in the United States, because it has gone far too long undiscussed and hidden and ignored very successfully, if I might add, by the 90% of the upper caste population. So that's what I'm trying to do. Just talk more about caste, understand caste, and create a space for how there is a minority within the minority in the US.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to seeing more of that. So you did mention Isabel Wilkerson's book. So before we end, do you have, what were your opinions about that book? Because it has really kind of been a big release in the United States. So can you give us your thoughts as someone who works with caste from the other kind of side of the spectrum?
Yeah, I'm. The reason I'm smiling about this question is because I did review that book for Foreign Policy magazine back in September. So for my detailed opinions, those of you are interested, Foreign Policy, my review on caste. Of course, it's an incredible, brilliant book. The way it frames race in the United States, the history, the research, the dots that connect from the past to the present, and Miss Wilkerson's objectivity in doing this huge undertaking is something that is inspirational, and especially for somebody like me, it's something that I learned so much from reading, not just about the subject, but also about the craft of writing this book. And I have nothing but huge praise for it. However, I would like to add that while Wilkerson frames caste in ways that are about race, and she mentions three kinds of caste systems that exist around the world: the Nazi Germany, Indian caste system, and race in the United States. Unfortunately, in the book, for whatever reasons, whether it was for an audience that's majorly, excuse me, sorry, whether it was for an audience that was majorly in the United States or editing purposes, it does not look at the Indian caste system in the same detailed way. So I felt that even on this level, sorry.
Sorry, we've
I
had
promise
you talking.
this is not about Wilkerson's book. It's just about my throat.
We've had you talking all day, so that's our fault.
My bad. No, of course not. Happy to do that. But I think what the book does is, we need to look at in the global order India versus US, where they both stand. And of course, US captures global imagination. It's a first world country. So even on that platform, India and Indian caste system, which is the story of Dalits, does not quite deserve the same platform that Nazi Germany does. So that's my take on the book, that, I wish it would have brought our stories out in a more comprehensive way, in the similar way that Miss Wilkerson looks at Germany. if she looked at India, that would have been really helpful, instead of using that system as simply a framework for the readers to understand race, because we also have our own stories. But I guess that's a job for other books. That's for people like me to do. So, that, but my review is available on Foreign Policy for those of you who would want to read.
Well, thank you so much. So for people who are interested, check out the book coming out as Dalit. It's really wonderful. But thank you so much to Yashica for joining us. We really appreciate it. And for anyone who's interested, we will be putting a recording of this lecture on YouTube. So you'll be getting an email tomorrow with the link to that. But thank you everyone so much for joining us. And we hope that everyone has a good night.
Thank you
Good
so
night,
much for
everyone.
having me, Amy.
Yeah, thank you so much.